I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
You know, we live in an age, at least once a week, somebody asks me, do we need libraries anymore? Everything's on the Google, isn't it? And I'm like, well, the Google machine doesn't have everything.
That was from my recent conversation with Dr. Pak Eun-A, Associate Professor of Strategic Communication at Western State Colorado University, and Dustin Fife, Director of Library Services. Our topic was the proliferation of fake news and how media and information literacy can help solve the problem. Stay tuned for more on this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by the Western State Colorado University Office of Academic Affairs. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio patron, visit alanwardesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
Dustin, Dr. Park, thank you so much for joining me today.
Mm-hmm.
Now listen, I want to acknowledge right from the beginning that we have set ourselves a nearly impossible task, and that is to talk about something as large and sweeping as information literacy and fake news in our society today in less than an hour. So we're just going to say that right up front, that we're not going to get it all done. And in fact, this is a complex issue, right? I mean, I went online and I found this nice, sterile academic definition. I'm going to read it to you.
Mm-hmm.
That information literacy is the ability to recognize when information is needed and to locate, evaluate, and use efficiently the needed information.
And that comes straight from the American Library Association. I know that definition well. Is that the one you found?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
But as soon as I read it, I thought, wow, this issue is so much more than that.
Yes.
So let's dive right in, and I would like to have each of you give me your definition, your sort of real-world, on-the-ground working definition. What is information literacy? Dustin?
I also, from the very start, want to recognize that none of these issues are new, and they're all incredibly old. The idea of fake news is intertwined with the idea of propaganda from the very beginning of any sort of society and the way that we talk about ourselves and all of those things. So in class, when I'm working with students, the way I talk about information literacy is being able to find and access information and then being able to evaluate that information. You know, we live in an age, at least once a week, somebody asks me, do we need libraries anymore? Everything's on the Google, isn't it? And I'm like, well, the Google machine doesn't have everything. And even if it did, information literacy isn't necessarily even about how you access it, meaning which medium or machine or however you're going to do it, but knowing and learning the skills to access information, most good information, things like that, are still behind paywalls and other things like that. So the need for communal purchasing of resources remains and will remain for a long time.
Well, let's go back to finding it to begin with. I mean, these days, one of the things that consumers really like are news aggregators. What's wrong with letting Google, pull together the stories of the day, and that's what I see?
You have to always remember that every machine, every person is built upon programming and biases and all of the things that make the decisions that it does. So we're just learning how much data that something like Facebook stores about you. And they start to make decisions that they think they want you to make for you. And lots of times they're correct. So there's a classic example of this. The comparison we often use is the Arab Spring. So when all the protests were happening in Egypt during the Arab Spring, and you did a search about Egypt, if you were someone who searched news a lot, all of a sudden, all of that information would have filtered itself to the top about, hey, there's these protests. It's actually a very violent time in Egypt. There's a lot that's going on. If you're somebody who doesn't read the news, hardly at all, but you read travel websites all of the time, then you're always on Travelocity just pretending to, hey, how much would it cost for me to go here and there? All of that travel information would filter itself to the top
because you'd inputted the
Yeah.
word Egypt.
well, no, because of the way your profile from that news aggregator had been built about you, what Google was trying to do for you. So in the middle of the Arab Spring, all of a sudden Google is bringing up all these travel deals to Egypt, when at the same time the State Department's saying don't travel to Egypt. So the question is, do you know what choices are being made for you?
And most people don't.
And most people don't. And are you okay with those choices being made for you? So I try to, on particular computers, limit the amount of times I sign in, the types of work I do on those computers, so that I can have a fairly good chance at a broader range of results when I search, when I look for information. So that's Mickey, what do you think?
Actually, I came here as a media scholar, and then I wanted to address about media literacy, not exactly information literacy, but we are sharing a lot. You are addressing this issue from the librarian perspective. I can address this issue from media scholars' perspective.
Well, so please do. I mean, you've done a lot of research on the subject of social media and how that shapes the way we collect and process and receive information. So what about this issue of the platform itself? So the computer itself, what role does it play?
It's like, as Dustin addressed, it has a Google filtering bubbles. The concept of filtering bubble is like this. Everybody has a different preference, different lifestyle, different search history. Based on your pre-existing history and preference, the Google will produce different information to you. Whenever you search, exactly the same word, but your result will be different. And then people have been criticizing about this filtering bubbles, how to avoid this, to get out the bubble and to get access to more balanced information.
Well, so what's your answer to that question?
In my journalism class, media writing class, I was asking, have you ever heard of DuckDuckGo? That is not using filtering technologies.
And say that again, because I don't think I had heard of it.
So there's a bunch of tools out there. The one Mickey's talking about is called DuckDuckGo, and it is a search engine just like Bing or Google. It doesn't collect data about the person or the mechanism that's using the search. So like when I say Google knows things about you when it does a search, it's not just about you personally. Like it's looking at the type of internet connection you have, the type of hardware and software that your computer has. It's making predictions about the type of money you have based upon the type of computer you're using. So DuckDuckGo really tries to cut that out. There's a lot of other great tools, something called Privacy Badger, and these things that stop second parties from collecting data about you. You've all heard of ad blockers, but ad blockers, Privacy Badger, DuckDuckGo, there's a bunch of incredible tools to let you get out of the filter bubble. And I'm really glad Mickey brought up the phrase filter bubble. If you remember nothing else about anything we talk about today, just sit down and read about filter bubbles, because I think the best step for getting out of a filter bubble is being aware that you're always in a filter bubble.
Well, certainly. Well, so in other words, you're saying if I've got a cheap $400 laptop that I'm browsing on, then Google Ads is going to send me shoes from Payless, not Neiman Marcus.
I wouldn't say it exactly like that. I would say it's always making assumptions about you and what those exact assumptions, because you can't, because a Chromebook is one of the cheapest computers out there. So it's not just price, it's the type of technology you're using.
I see.
The type of software, even if it's free software, that the type of person who would download this particular software. It uses all of the information it can to make assumptions about you, and those assumptions often can be correct, and sometimes they're not.
Yeah, and then social media also providing the same mechanism to you. In searching for information, you are connected with your friends or family, right? They are mostly more likely to share something in common, and then you are more like a friend with them, and that they're posting whatever information they think it's interesting to them, right? And then you are following them, you are liking them, you are just sharing them, retweeting them, and then that will make another bubble. We are more likely to polarize to our own preference. our preferred, political thoughts and ideas.
And that means that I'm going to see those things that I already am inclined to agree with.
Yeah, generally we associate with people that are similar to us in particular ways. And the term I use for this a lot that goes along with the filter bubble is an echo chamber. So the example of this I use
That's what you check.
Yeah, the example I use in my class all the time is I pull up this image of my own Twitter conversation. So my two brothers and I, we're all white. We all come from the exact same family. We all have similar levels of education. We all have similar likes. We like hiking. We like sports. We read a ton about politics. So I can pull up a Twitter conversation between me and my two brothers that has been going on for years now. We also have one in Instagram and in Facebook because we all use all of these different social media mediums. So I can pull up a Twitter conversation that will show all three of us sharing the same tweet with each other within about 2 minutes. So we all saw it somewhere. We all are like, oh, I got to show my brothers this. And so we share it with each other. And it's like 1, 2, 3, we've all shared it. And then one of us claims we're like, I was first.
Yeah.
Like some sort of supremacy from having been the first to share it. But how crazy is that these 3 separate people on their own, like, because we all think alike. And so we are an echo chamber for each other. So we do things to intentionally get out of that and to be in other bubbles and look for other information. But
yeah.
Right.
Well, so let's bring it back around then to this sort of key part of the definition of information literacy, which is the ability to evaluate what it is that you're seeing. But if what it is you're seeing is already pre-sorted, how do you go about doing that? I mean, what are the techniques that you would recommend to people to, as you said, break out of your filter bubble? Although, Dustin, you just told us we're always in one. And so does that mean, purposely join a chat group that is at the other end of the spectrum from you? Or how do you do that?
Well, and Mickey can address that.
For me, I'm discussing about this issue with students. Mostly, first of all, they have to be aware of that filtering bubbles.
And do you think most people are at this point? Are we starting to learn this, or are most people still pretty oblivious to this idea?
I think people are very happy and warm in their own filter bubbles for the most part.
Yeah, they're kind of comforting, aren't they?
I think until now, many American people, would be understand what that means, but they don't know how it could happen to them. Mm-hmm. They have no idea about it clearly, but they have known this issue, fake news stuff, because it's everywhere.
Yeah,
in media talked about a lot, but they have to be aware, and before they build up their own opinion about certain issue, they have to stay back and then ask a question about themselves.
What is my bubble?
Yes,
which
that is
bubble
my
am I
bubble.
in?
Is it the balanced idea, balanced opinion? Is it really genuine news item or not? I would strongly recommend the students to ask a question first before you just accept absorbing this information. And to build up your opinion, you have to ask a question. But it'll take a time to practice this behavior.
Sure.
Because, mostly when you see the big headline, you're going to more likely catch it, believe it.
Well, this brings up an interesting point, because this would be hard enough if news providers were all good-natured in their approach to the whole thing. But the fact is they're not.
Yes. Because
headlines are written with it in mind. We use the term clickbait.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact is, what we're being fed is not just a matter of sorting through various low-level biases.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of looking at it for falsehood, even. That's a big task, because suppose I look at one of those headlines and I say, that doesn't sound right to me. I want to look into it deeper. What now? What next?
So I would say this, and there's a couple things I can address here. Every single one of us has at least one source that we follow that if we really asked ourselves a question, we know is probably a poor manipulative source. But it's like, this person just throws out news that tells me what I want to hear, and it feels warm and snuggly, and I'm going to keep following them even if I'm not going to always trust them. So this isn't going to come as a shock. What both Mickey and I are recommending is a certain level of skepticism. We teach at a university. We teach people every day to ask questions. So that's the easiest answer to this is you need to have a certain level of skepticism when you ingest any type of news source. That's a lot of work. And we all have lots of shortcuts that we build. And what I narrow that down to is telling people that they need to evaluate the shortcuts they've built for themselves every once in a while. So, for example, we all turn to certain news sites and we trust this news site over that news site. And there's a good reason for that. And we've built a shortcut because we can't make every single decision every time. So we all build shortcuts. Question your shortcuts periodically. Hey, why am I so enamored with this particular journal, with this news source, with this television presenter, with this news broadcaster? You take any number of them, they're very fallible. But one example is, you see our current administration in the United States. Anytime the news makes a mistake, there's a very different reaction. So like when you see President Trump make a mistake, he doubles down and he says it over and over and over again until someone out in the world believes it's true. When a news organization makes a mistake, they tend to redact the story and then fire the reporter and say, hey, our bad. And President Trump will then, and I don't want to talk about him too much, but he'll grab onto them having to have had to redact a story and say, look, it's all fake news, they're liars, when it should actually almost have the opposite effect on us. Like the fact that they redacted their story, the fact that they said we made a mistake should give you more faith in them than the fact that of somebody doubling down and pretending to never be wrong.
So we've identified a few obstacles already that face the average citizen in trying to be well informed. The media itself is aggregating news in such a way that makes it difficult. Our own biases work against us. We like being comfortable. But there's this other thing right now that seems to be worse than it perhaps has been in recent years. Not ever, certainly, but worse than it was. And that is how polarized our political discourse has become. In that environment, do you think it's even possible to have a functioning public conversation with ourselves if all of the various political persuasions are just only hearing what makes them feel good?
It's similar as Dustin suggested, but that's what I have been suggesting to my students, as a professor. And if it's not important to you, you can skip it, right? We are usually skimming news items, not pay attention too much. That's the reason maybe behind such a fake news stuff, importance of understanding what is genuine, what is not. But still, if it's not very much, it has nothing to do with you do not pay attention to. But if it's really important, like politics, important, economic decisions, very important, those are things you have to try to find the multiple sources to read one news item, to try to find the more balanced ideas.
But if I'm on the liberal side of the spectrum, our political climate has taught me to think that anything a conservative says is wrong, misleading, out to trap me in something that I don't want. How do you convince people to go and partake of the other side of the story when we're convinced that they're evil?
As an educator, we are trying to put more layer into your brain, okay? Because, you feel more comfortable with your own ideas, you have to break it. You have to break it to get, advancing in your learning and educating yourself. And then I was trying to, emphasizing on if you are liberal, if you think you're liberal, try to read the Fox News or try to read, other alternative media addressing more conservative opinion, different opinion. Just get exposed to them.
And what do people say to you when you tell them that?
They are just nodding. They're students, okay? They're just accepting what I'm saying. But that'll make you more open to other ideas, other opinions. But still, the media echo chamber, as you said, and then we try to avoid it. Okay, it's effort, but it's more educated and responsible behaviors you have to get familiar with and then just habituate it.
Well, you've
yourself.
used a key word there, and that's responsible. Personal responsibility. But I don't want to leave this question just
Yeah,
yet.
let me talk about false equivalency really quick and give you an example that hopefully will help you illustrate this for the rest of your life. And I'm a librarian, so I'm going to talk about how you collect books. So say you're a library that tries to collect every academic book, and how this would be very different than what we see on the news every single day. So you take an issue such as climate change, and, far and away, most scientific research shows that there's some sort of man-made involvement and impact on climate change. And so if 95% of all of these scholars are agreeing and publishing books and papers, you go to the shelf and you look at the shelf, and 95 out of 100 books are going to be about how human beings are impacting climate change. And then you're going to have 5 books out of the 100 that have some sort of disagreement. So What's the difference between that and what you see on the nightly news?
I didn't realize there would be homework.
So you're talking about climate change on the nightly news. What do? They plop one person there who agrees, one person there that disagrees, and they give them equal time.
It doesn't reflect the actual distribution of opinion.
It does not reflect the scholarship. It does not reflect the ideas that are relevant in society. It gives a false idea of what the platform actually is. So, and science can be wrong, but the whole point of science is it's supposed to be wrong, and it's supposed to be tested time and time again and prove itself over time. That's not what the news does. The news tries to build a conversation, and so they give equal airtime, which in our minds starts to kind of build these false equivalencies. So I want you to think about what that bookshelf would look like on this topic rather than what the coverage of the news looks like.
And so let's take your example then and go back to my question, which is that one-on-one interview is going out to a population that is equally divided, and they're all thinking, that guy's an idiot. They're not taking the opportunity to actually listen, mostly these days, because our political environment has decayed to the point where we're not just saying, I don't agree with you. We're saying, you're stupid. How do we back up from that?
I think about 2 dates a lot. And one of those is the first airing of CNN. That is a very particularly important date for me in thinking about why our society looks the way it does. It utterly changed the way we think about news.
Do you think that's because it introduced the 24-hour news cycle?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the 24-hour news cycle. The other one is in 1996, basically, you have building widespread access to the internet. Those are 2 things that have shaped our society more right now, especially politically, and how we get information. We have an extreme conflation now of opinion and editorial writing with news and journalism, and they're almost indistinguishable for most people in our society.
ThinkRadio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper. ThinkRadio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can join the ThinkRadio community of patrons, visit alanwartismedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
So let's back up and make sure those are defined well. A news story is one that presents the facts,
At least tries
to, in a balanced way. And the idea is we're not telling you how to think about this or what to think. We're just giving you the tools you need to think.
And there's always some editorializing in every news story.
Yeah,
like
word choices.
You make choices about what you report, what you don't report. So it's not a clean separation, and I want to make that very clear. And I know it's not a clean separation.
But traditionally, an editorial on the other side was something that was clearly the opinion of the writer or the publication. And what you just said was those 2 have started to mingle?
I think for a lot of people, they're indistinguishable. They don't know the difference between them. And Dr. Park can really talk about this.
I have summarize my understanding about this issue from the media scholars' perspective, there's some historical trend. Okay, earlier there were only few news sources, right? 3 or 4 broadcast networks and radio or a couple of local newspapers, right? And Americans usually would get the information from them. And then we have agenda setting theory, gatekeeping theory, like elites. The media elites will filtering some information for you, and then you just consume it as is suggested by the media, mass media. But now it's different, right? We do not have a common set of experience, a widely shared knowledge now because media has been so diversified into many different, democratized and personalized. Nowadays, everybody different apps, different news apps on your cell phones, and then people get access to information in different ways. You think news items will be all the same? Yes, maybe. The sources may be smaller, but still many people will get their news on their own items, own media, right? And then there's another aspect. There's more competition for audience because of this diversified media environment. And then they're all looking for the eyeballs, same audience, right? And then they need to get attention more. And then there's a rise in adversarial journalism because they have to make their news items, their programs more sensational to get more attention from the audience, and deliberately provoke a controversy to attract an audience, and then also clickbait journalism. Clickbait journalism means headlines and news stories that attract attention rather than inform people.
They're selling advertising. They're not selling news.
Yeah, more standing out. And then another phenomena is because of this, there's a rise of partisan websites, and then on the right and the left, there are news sites that only cater to a small extreme fringe of the market. And they are filled with sensational stories. Their whole purpose is draw an audience, then sell advertising and products. And then I heard, to get 6 million people a day. And then the writer was making money, $5,000 for 15 minutes investment in developing fake news story.
Yeah.
And there are thousands of these.
Yes.
Thousands of these. People who have not been to journalism school, who are not governed by an editorial board.
Yes.
They're governed by advertising trends.
Well, they're not governed by ethics. So the way I discuss this is my favorite phrase to give in class, is that Walter Cronkite is both figuratively and literally dead. And what I mean about this is this conversation that we have about gatekeepers. Walter Cronkite basically turned American opinion about the Vietnam War. He was that essential as the main best-known broadcaster in the 1960s and 70s that when Walter Cronkite started to question the Vietnam War, mainstream America started to question the Vietnam War. So what we're talking about is gatekeepers. There are essential gatekeepers, and they exist. Teachers are gatekeepers. News broadcasters are gatekeepers. Librarians, journalists, all of these groups are gatekeepers. They make decisions that impact the way you experience your news. But those gatekeepers don't have as much power as they once did because of, as Dr. Park pointed out, the diversification of sources. And also the trend that people have their own gatekeepers. So they're getting their news or their politics from a secondary or tertiary source. They don't care if it's from Fox News or if it's from the Washington Post or if it's from the New York Times. They care that their best friend Tim shared it on Facebook, reposted it.
Yeah.
Like their gatekeepers aren't those professional gatekeepers. Their gatekeepers are the people that they trust to repost things. And they're like, okay, I'm going to read this particular story because my crazy uncle Carl shared it. And I know it's crazy just because Carl shared it, because he only shares crazy things that he learned about immigration in his basement.
Well, when Mark Riemann, the editor of the Crested Butte News, was in here having a similar conversation, he said that makes everyone a publisher now. That
Yes,
that it's not
very
just that
true.
we have thousands of
Yes.
these, but because of that phenomenon you just identified, everyone
Yes.
is publishing content. They're republishing it, but it has the same impact.
Well, everyone is curating content. Like
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can use the word publishing, but what they're actually doing is they're curating the content for you. Same thing that Google is doing is it's aggregating and curating content that it thinks you would like more than other content. The point is everyone chooses their own curators, and we all are involved in this practice of curating content for ourselves and for the other people that we're connected to in our lives. I talk about responsibility a lot. I do a presentation for faculty at universities called Peer Review is Dead. And the point of it isn't that peer review is actually dead. It's that peer review is not the golden goose that it once was for both good and bad reasons. And the truth of the matter is, even with what we're talking about with technology, I think technology is a lot like human beings. Its best and worst qualities come from its same aspects. And we're all like that to some extent. Like
Yeah.
the best parts of us and the worst parts of us are kind of driven by the same neuroses. And it's just situational. We talk about a flood or an explosion or a deluge of information resources because all of a sudden the world is being opened up. And that language in and of itself is negative language. A flood is not a good thing. An explosion is not a good thing. I don't believe it's a bad thing. I believe it's a thing that has good and bad things about it. The democratization and the diversification of information allows a much larger participation base that allows for groups that have always been marginalized, women, people of color, immigrant groups in the United States to have a voice, to have places where they can have a platform that launches them into the public discourse. At the same time, now everyone has a voice. So it's
pretty loud out there.
We're empowering the marginalized and also drowning out the marginalized at the same time.
Yeah.
By eliminating these gatekeepers. So it's a good and it's a bad thing. The personal responsibility, and all of my talks come back to this, that information consumption has shifted from there being really strong gatekeepers and really strong mechanisms like peer review to having a much stronger personal component and a much stronger need for ongoing personal skepticism. That you're constantly questioning your methodology for how you ingest information. Mickey?
You address, what I wanted to address and what I wanted to talk about, especially, diversity of voices. New technology has good things and bad things, right? And the good thing is that there will be ensuring the diversity in terms of voices. You have tools, you have easily access to information, you have easily publishing your information. But, the counter argument is very interesting because I was referring to this information in my published article. It was about divide in terms of using information, like something like tweeting. Who is tweeting? Who is creating the information? Less than 20%. More than 80%, it's just retweeting. We are not creator of contents. We are consumers of contents.
But that brings us back to
Through
the
social
echo
media.
chamber, right?
Right.
Because
yes,
okay,
it's
it may be a
related.
diverse voice, but if it's only just speaking
Yes,
to
that
itself,
means a lot because sometimes influential the media users like very active tweeters and active Instagram users, active YouTube users will be more influential, more power, and more represented, overrepresented online, and then there will be some people to be underrepresented. My favorite example is about Eun-A, the singer.
the celebrities.
Yes, the celebrity has more interest in political issue, for example, just happen to get to know about Obamacare, for example. It's a very critical issue and then very influential issue to American life. But she just happened to pick it up, this interest, and then talking about her own opinion.
And that's
on,
the one that gets
yes,
retweeted.
Yes.
Yes.
And then she must have a lot of, million, billion followers, and they would be sharing with her. And then she will be overrepresented in the Obamacare issue. And then you may be less represented because you didn't like the post.
Oh, I'm
and
not
then-
represented at all.
Yes,
I can
yes,
tell you that.
Yes, maybe Dustin. Maybe Dustin.
You're a white dude. You're pretty represented.
Yes, and then you may be more knowledgeable about this issue. You may have more balanced ideas, but you are
Right.
still underrepresented.
Well, so here's a question then. Talking about these gatekeepers, because I love your example of Walter Cronkite and his power in those days to influence public opinion so powerfully. But we kind of look fondly on that story because we generally agree now that the Vietnam War was a bad thing, most of us. It could easily go the other way, where news figures are
Yes.
leading us in very, very dystopian and negative directions.
Yes.
Do you think that the breakdown of that kind of gatekeeper power and the proliferation of gatekeepers elsewhere is eventually, on balance, going to be a good thing? And maybe what we're in now is the infancy of this way of doing things, and we're just having to work it all out and get back to personal responsibility, but that on the whole, this is actually progress.
The hearing marginalized voices is something that was really hard to do in that traditional forum where there was very few gatekeepers and they were all old white guys, and that's who the gatekeepers were on the nightly news. And we've really seen that decline and a push towards kind of separate platforms. You kind of saw that coming to an end with Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather. And even now, someone who we kind of thought maybe had that mantle, Brian Williams, he had his own fall from grace, and now he's on MSNBC, which you would think of as, even though I think Lester Holt does a good job. So I think the trajectory of it has an incredible ability and possibility to lift up marginalized voices, and that is a good thing no matter what.
But we have to learn to listen. That's kind of the crux of this conversation, right? Okay, marginalized voices can be speaking their truth, but if nobody's listening, what difference does it make?
Well, there's definitely people listening. It's just a matter of how represented it is. Yes, is it
Because we're
under or overrepresented still?
Well, that's really not my point, though. My point is, if we're not able to evaluate critically the information that we are seeing, or we just turn it off because it's not in our filter bubble or whatever it was that you called that, we're still not getting anywhere. We have to bring ourselves to the place of personal responsibility and take it seriously that these voices are there now, and it's up to us to consume them, right? I mean, otherwise, what are we talking about here? It's just a cacophony out there.
I have hope that the trajectory is positive in the long term. From my perspective, as I've said, over time, these things go up and down, and I think for the moment, we are to some extent in a slight downward, possibly spiral. But the trajectory long term moves towards more voices, hopefully more justice, and hopefully more opportunity for more people. There is a lot of white noise, but white noise can be cut through. And you see very salient moments in our society. You know, what you're seeing with the students from Parkland right now, these students who are now student activists, like, that are causing some change. There are salient moments when voices break through the white noise. And I do have hope that in the long term, that trajectory is positive for society. I don't know what Mickey thinks.
Dr. Park, what gives you hope as you look forward?
Because, it's very helpful for me to see a lot of discussions about this issue has been still going on in American society
Like
about
this one.
fake news, this talk, and then how to avoid such a filtering bubble and something like that. You're talking a lot of literacy stuff, and then there is more advanced than South Korea, which is my country, and then I got access to the news items, and then that's very, very helpful. But from media mass communication perspective, it's not that bright in the future because we have been studying about media effects. Okay, through media, how people will be affected by media messages. And then we are assuming people are very passive recipients. But actually, currently now sometimes you're passive, sometimes you're active. And most of times you are more likely to active, like go to your own media and avoiding other media because I don't feel comfortable with that. And but still, you are based on your needs and wants, you're consuming the media, but over times you will be cultivated as suggested by media. For example, media is portraying a lot of violence or very promiscuous culture. You will get affected by that gradually because you will be more tolerated, you will be more cultivated to that direction.
But is the media violent and promiscuous because society is violent and promiscuous, or is society?
It's hard to tell which one started to affect.
Well, I'm going to have to jump in and say we're going to have to save that question for the next episode.
Oh, okay.
because I think that is
Yes.
that is a huge concept.
Yes.
But let me come back to the question though.
Yes.
Do you see any hope that can be overcome?
Yes, definitely. Yes, we have to educate people, and then American people should be trained. Keep being trained in how to make distinction between the genuine news and fake news. And something like Facebook has been criticized by their the lack of overseeing stuff, fake stuff on their platform, and then they were suggesting, okay, we are gonna evaluating the news item. We are gonna print the signal on their news item postings, and then you can see, oh, this is from 70% genuine, 85% genuine, something like that. Okay, based on just where does it come from? They're gonna print the sign. They said that, but currently now, they're just trying to be more focusing on other postings by done by people rather than news item themselves, right? They try to avoid such a responsibility, right? And they try to develop such a mechanism to make people believe, oh, this is coming from the real genuine source. This is not. It's a struggling, but there are much efforts. My point is that many entities, institutionally, they have been trying to develop and improve such situations. From the platform perspective, like Facebook, and from educators, from me, I'm just trying to teach more, and then Dustin doing, to improve immediate information literacy stuff. And then I think there's a hope because you are more aware of this issue thanks to 2016 election. It became a kind of facilitator for all kinds of issues. Actually, if you study about this issue, it started from the Daily Show. Fake parody news show. But younger generation, mostly younger generation, especially for women were consuming that, and they thought that this is real. It's not a parody. It's not a criticizing. Just as
well,
it
and
is.
so that brings us back to personal responsibility. We have to judge for ourselves what's real and what isn't, and sometimes it's obvious. We just don't want to see it.
Right.
But Dustin, I really want to end on this note because there's an event coming up that will discuss this in much greater detail. It's the Sociology Symposium or Conference. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so next Thursday and Friday, there's actually two events. So Thursday, I think it's the 12th at 7 p.m. in the West Wing of the Leslie J. Savage Library. There's going to be a panel discussion about media and fake news. Dr. Park is going to be a part of it. Joel Best, who is an incredible scholar from the University of Delaware, is going to be part of it. Chris Dickey, who owns and publishes the Gunnison Country Times, and Tony Todd are all going to be involved in this panel discussion about recognizing, working with, understanding, fake news. And it'll be a similar conversation to this in that there'll be a lot of theory around it. But the other goal is to really give some practical advice about not being conned. I think it was the CEO of Mozilla at the time who said, we've always had reading, writing, and arithmetic. But what it really needs to be now is reading, writing, arithmetic, and web literacy. And web literacy covers, to some extent, some of the same ideas as information literacy and media literacy. They're all talking about the same idea of recognizing and evaluating information, evaluating your own biases and understanding it. Then the next night, Friday night, Joel Best will be giving a keynote presentation. And if you've never heard of Dr. Joel Best, look him up. He has several incredible books, but he really talks about society and myth and how we use statistics to build stories and all of these things that lend themselves to this conversation. So that will be next Thursday and Friday, the 12th and 13th, and they're both at the library here at the university, and they're both in the old West Wing. Really, really exciting events for this our communities here.
And are they free to the public?
Yep, they're free. There'll be refreshments. Everyone.
Refreshments.
There's not just free to the public. These are not necessarily the Friday night one a little more, but Thursday night is not geared to students necessarily. It is geared to our communities here, to Gunnison, to Crested Butte, to Western State, to all of the communities within our communities to come together and have a conversation. So really, we'd love to see people there on the 12th and 13th. Overall, though, the conversation today, it will be touched on, and I'll help touch on it next week too, is there's a lot of personal responsibility in consuming information, and then how you build the world, how you interact with your communities because of the information you choose to consume. And I think that's kind of what comes home to me time and time again about why this is important to me, is because we consume all this information and then we make choices that don't just impact our lives, that impact the way we all interact in society together.
True.
All right.
Very true.
Thank you for the conversation. It's been most enlightening, and I look forward to the event next week.
Thank you.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. The show's executive producer is Isa Forrest. Associate producer, Kat Seibert. Original music by Isa Forrest. New episodes are available for download every Monday morning on iTunes and at alanwardismedia.com. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Think Radio.